Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we got to learn more about Paul and what was going on in his life during the year 1966. We also got some background on 3 of the songs that were going on the Revolver album. During this time, the Beatles hadn't had any new singles since We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper in December 1965. Capitol Records would put out a new American single every 2 or 3 months, so EMI was pressuring Brian Epstein and George Martin to produce a new single to maintain their momentum that they had in the U.S. over the last 2 years. The only problem was the new songs that they were creating weren't obvious singles. They couldn't do battle with the Walker Brothers, the Hollies, the Kinks, etc. John and Paul liked a challenge, and on April 12th, they got together at John's house to write a song that could be a single. Paul had an hour drive to John's home in Weybridge, so he came up with the idea of a would-be novelist begging to be published. Paul loved the beat of the words paperback writer. He was also challenged by his Aunt Millie, who said, "Why do you write songs about love all the time? Can't you ever write about a horse or the Summit Conference or something interesting?" And Paul thought, "All right, Aunt Mill, I'll show you." So the lyrics took the form of a letter. When Paul got to John's, he had the title, the theme, and the format, but no actual lyric or tune. Over a cup of tea, Paul talked it through with John and began writing out the words in the form of a letter. As Paul spoke the lines, John nodded, and they went together to John's music room to compose the tune. The other song they had considered for a single was the song Rain. It started out of John's idea, and Paul said he was like 30% responsible for it. To Paul, he thought the song meant it was a pleasurable side of rain, and then rain, according to the book that John was reading, was more philosophical. John was tackling the issue of consciousness and the need to expand or alter it. A rainstorm, he said, was a state of mind about how we feel getting showered on. For the song Paperback Writer, Paul wanted the bass to be featured more. Motown was doing that in their songs, and recent British groups are doing it. The Who with My Generation and Substitute, and then the Spencer Davis Group had the songs Keep On Running and Somebody Help Me. When Paul was in America in August of 1965, he was given a custom-made left-handed Rickenbacker 4001S, and he used it on Rubber Soul. He continued to use his Hofner violin bass on stage because it was lighter and it better suited him for live performance. Paul asked Jeff Limerick to enhance the sound of the bass so it could be the lead instrument instead of being buried. Emmerich came up with a solution. Instead of putting a normal microphone in front of the bass speaker, he rewired a loudspeaker so that it could become a microphone. The result was so powerful that it exceeded the limits of the EMI rule books. This was because the high-volume recordings could cause the styli to jump out of the groove of the vinyl records. The Beatles, though, were a valuable act for EMI, so they got away with it. Rain was recorded in 5 takes the next day, also using the heavy bass sound, and they used a backward chorus. John always had the story that he took home a rough mono mix, and he played it. But when he played it, he was so stoned he threaded the tape wrong, and the track came out backwards. He asked George Martin the next day to splice a backward section of the song near the end of the tape. George Martin said that didn't happen. Martin said he created it. Martin suggested that they try and turn this round, and when John was out, Martin lifted off the voice track, turned it back, slid it around until he found a good spot, and he played it to John when he came back, and John fell on the floor. He thought it was great. George Martin said he had been experimenting with tapes for years before the Beatles came along, and this would be the B-side of the Paperback Writer. Dr. Robert was the next song to be written by John, and this song was inspired by their experiences with the drug culture and drugs. It was recorded on April 17th, and it was the story of a doctor dispensing drugs to those in need. Paul said it was about those notorious physicians who dispense shots to affluent revelers wanting to live a 24-hour party lifestyle. The Beatles had been using amphetamine since their days of playing in Hamburg. It was a drug of choice for musicians having to stay awake at all nightclubs. Paul said that John's song was about a specific physician who he'd heard of, and it was probably Dr. Robert Freeman, who had a clinic on East 78th Street at that time. At that time, it was legal to supply amphetamines in this way. This song is kind of brief and punchy, and the only studio trick was the use of what was known as ATD, automatic double tracking or artificial double tracking, on John's vocal. Later, it became a standard recording practice. John always requested to sound different. ADT allowed the vocal to be doubled up, but very slightly out of sync, and this altered the sound of the voice by thickening it. The next song was John's, and it was Your Bird Can Sing. The lyric was a puzzle, and John never really explained it. In 1971, he said the song was a horror, and in 1980, he said it was another of my throwaways. And Paul said it was John doing his Jabberwocky thing. The theme of the song was an attack on someone he didn't feel was hip enough to get him. Since childhood, John felt he was different and that he was born with a special insight. LSD made him feel this way even more. The recording was started on April 20th, but the two versions taped that day were nothing like the eventual release. Next up was Tax Man. It was a protest about the so-called super tax that George was angry about. George felt that the pop stars needed a fair share of the country's wealth, and he wanted to reduce taxes drastically. George said they couldn't pull the taxes down because they didn't have enough money. They were buying F-111s, fighter bombers. The chorus was inspired by the theme song from the Batman series, and this would be the first song by the Beatles to address anything political. So lately on the radio there have been political songs released by music artists. The song was credited to George, but Paul played a blistering guitar solo in the middle. Paul thought that it was one of his best, and John said he threw out a few one-liners to help the song along because George asked him to. And John's sarcasm elevated the lyric. They did 11 takes of Tax Man in under 10.5 hours, and the next day they added a cowbell on May 16th a fake 1, 2, 3, 4 count-in. Your Bird Can Sing was re-recorded on April 26th, and then they started to work on John's I'm Only Sleeping. He composed it on the back of an unpaid radio telephone bill. It was a reminder that he owed 12 pounds. The song was thought to be about sleeping or about drugs. Friends and colleagues knew that John loved his bed, and Maureen Cleave called him possibly the laziest man in Britain. John admitted to her that he was physically lazy. He said, I don't mind writing or reading or watching or speaking, but sex was the only physical thing he could be bothered with. In February 1964, he told Rave magazine, the trouble is I'm dead lazy. You need discipline to write, and I'm too easily sidetracked. John was often still in bed when Paul arrived for their songwriting sessions, and Paul was well-organized craftsman ready to get down to work. And John was a casual bohemian who preferred to write only when inspiration struck. The language in the song borrowed from the psychedelic experience. The part about floating downstream was changed to floating upstream. John was practicing the art of detachment by lying there and staring at the ceiling rather than getting tangled in the games of life. At this time, the track only had an acoustic guitar and John's voice. The experimental work would take place next month. Now we come to the Empire Pool at Wembley in North London. It was built in 1934, and it hadn't been used as a swimming pool since 1948. It became one of the country's largest indoor arenas, and it seated 10,000 people. It was the regular venue for the NME Poll Winners Concert. It was a show that would feature what the paper's readers considered the best of the established acts around and the brightest hopes for the future. Readers could vote, and the winning musicians would be invited to appear at a concert in April or May, where they would have a short performance spot and then be presented with their awards. Popular radio DJs would host the evening. And the Beatles had appeared every year since 1963. Well, the bill for May 1st included the Seekers, the Walker Brothers, the Yardbirds, Small Faces, the Who, the Stones, Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and Roy Orbison. That's quite a lineup. So the Beatles arrived at the service entrance dressed as chefs in white aprons and small caps, and they each had a tray of food. It fooled the fans, but once they got into the kitchen, Ringo slipped on the greasy floor, and his tray of goodies landed in the path of his fellow Beatles. The show was already in progress when they got to their dressing room, and the Beatles hoped to be able to get ready to go on stage, perform, and leave swiftly in their escape vehicle. When they arrived in the huge building area backstage, the Rolling Stones were performing their song The Last Time, and then they were going to do Play with Fire and Satisfaction, and then there was going to be the award ceremony. And when NME publisher Maurice Ken told John the group wasn't needed for at least another 25 minutes, John exploded. He wanted to trump the Stones by following them immediately before the applause died down. John said they weren't waiting all day, they were going to go on now. And then Ken took John into the corridor and explained that he couldn't go back on the agreement of Andrew Oldham. And then John said the other alternative is that they wouldn't play at all. Ken tried to reason with Brian Epstein, but his attitude was that the boys were beyond his control. Ken told Epstein that either the Beatles played immediately after the awards, as they had agreed, or that DJ Jimmy Savile would be sent out to announce that the Beatles were on site but refused to appear. Ken said that the fans of 10,000 would be rioting and causing damage, and that NIMS would be having to pay for it, and that NME would sue Epstein for breach of contract. So Epstein gave in to Ken's demands, but refused to sign an agreement with ABC TV, the company filming the event. All they would be allowed to cover of the Beatles' appearance was the group members receiving their awards. John didn't like the Stones getting their own way, and he cornered Ken and screamed at him. Ken later said it was abuse like you never heard in the whole of your life. John said, "You can't do this, Tess. We'll never appear on one of your shows ever again." The Beatles did put on a good show. They dressed in dark suits and black turtlenecks and played I Feel Fine, Nowhere Man, Day Tripper, If I Needed Someone, and I'm Down during their 15-minute set. John's threat proved to be true, and they never played NME poll winners concert again, and they never played in concert in Britain again. The Beatles next went to have an interview with the radio host Brian Matthew, and Matthew asked, since the end of 1965, there was no touring, no TV, and very little radio. Were they trying to retire? And why was it taking so long to record an album? George said, "We spend more time on recording now because we prefer recording." And John said that they were working on an LP. He said they liked recording. So Matthew then spoke alone with Ringo, and he said he liked to be able to sit at home and do nothing. He said, "We used to work practically every night, and we were always tired and hungry. Now we have plenty of time off." Ringo didn't seem to be highly motivated, and he said he had a short attention span and admitted that he was in danger of turning into a blob if work didn't propel him into action. The best thing about his life now was that he had no worries. Next, Matthew spoke to Paul, who was becoming the spokesman for the Beatles, and Paul talked briefly about the loss of privacy that came with fame, that he was expanding his cultural experiences. After the Brian Matthew interview at BBC, Paul and John went to the nightclub Dolly's at 5758 Jermyn Street, accompanied by Neil Aspinall and Rolling Stones' Keith Richards and Brian Jones. Bob Dylan was at the club, and later all six men returned to Dylan's suite at the Mayfair Hotel. Paul and Dylan were playing pressings of their latest songs, and then Paul played Tomorrow Never Knows. Dylan didn't show any emotion, and then turned to him and said, "Oh, I get it. You don't want to be cute anymore." So Dylan implied that cute was all the Beatles had ever been, and that Tomorrow Never Knows was an exercise in confounding the expectations rather than a change in their art. Dylan at that time didn't really connect with Paul, and Dylan's thoughts were always somewhere else. Dylan played some of his own tracks, and it was to be on his Blonde on Blonde album. Dylan, even though he didn't seem impressed with the song Paul played, knew that they were exploring similar territory. The Beatles were into the mystical potential of drugs, and Dylan wrote more about the paranoia of having a strangled mind or the ecstasy of getting stoned. John admired Dylan, but thought his lyrics were phony. John thought that Dylan used literary trickery to dazzle his listeners, and he felt the lines had no real wisdom at their core. Bob Dylan, at the 2007 interview in Rolling Stone, somehow had a change of heart about Paul. He said he was in awe of him, and that his talent was all-embracing, that Paul had a gift for melody. He's got the gift for rhythm. He could play any instrument. He can scream and shout as good as anyone, and he could sing a ballad as good as anyone, and his melodies are effortless. And that's what you have to be in awe of. He's just so effortless. So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we found out that people were starting to wonder if the Beatles were going to retire because they hadn't been seen around much, and they hadn't released any singles lately. John and Paul decided to remedy that by creating 2 songs for a single, Paperback Writer and Rain. Then we got to hear other songs that they were writing and recording for the Revolver album, I'm Only Sleeping, Taxman, and Your Bird Can Sing. So it was neat to hear what they did to create the song and how they felt about the song and what inspired them to do it. I hadn't heard about the NME poll winners concert, and it felt like the Beatles were looking for an excuse not to play the concert, and when they didn't get what they wanted, they never played that venue again. Brian, it sounds like at this point, couldn't control the Beatles any longer, and that must have stressed him out. The meeting between Bob Dylan, John, and Paul was interesting too. We got to see how they felt about each other, and Bob downplayed the song Paul had played, but he might have been feeling threatened because they were getting into new territory, just as he was. So this was another revealing part of the book that I enjoyed, learning how the Beatles came up with their songs and seeing how they interacted with their contemporaries as well. So we'll continue exploring the book Beatles 1966, The Revolutionary Year, in the next episode and see what else we can find out. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.